At the time, there was no thought about blacks and black history and black Canadians. And we were talking about ice cream and yogurt, boneless beef, the GST. I mean, those were the big things. And here I come asking members to participate and to join with me in declaring February Black History Month in Canada. That was an uphill because it could have been negotiated differently if the chair of the caucus had taken it and negotiate with the other House leaders, but he said they wouldn't think that's important. So I had to do it myself, which made it difficult. I had to talk to one by one by one by one.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. The Honourable Jean Augustine, educator, community advocate, politician. Jean Augustine has advocated for women's rights, community initiatives, Black lives, diversity, and equality for her entire adult life. Jean immigrated to Canada in 1960 on the Canada-Caribbean Domestic Program. She already qualified as a teacher, but went on to study at Toronto's Teachers College before earning a BA from the University of Toronto. Jean worked as elementary school teacher with the Metropolitan Separate School Board, where she was promoted to principal, then supervisory officer. Jean was first elected to the House of Commons as MP for Etobicoke Lakeshore in 1993. She was Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, and then Minister of Multiculturalism and the Status of Women, the first Black woman to serve as Minister of the Crown, and she was 3-time Chair of the National Women's Caucus. Following her retirement from the House of Commons, she became the first Ontario Fairness Commissioner from 2007 to 2015. She has served on boards including York University, the Hospital for Sick Children, Stephen Lewis Foundation, and the Harbourfront Corporation. She also set up the Jean Augustine Centre for Women's Empowerment, making use of her expertise to share knowledge and help support women. Jean is the subject of the 2022 documentary, Steadfast, the Jean Augustine Story.
Jean Augustine, this is about your life, your story, and your work, those influences that attracted you first to Canada, and then as an educator in public service. You were born in Grenada and immigrated to Canada in 1960 when you were only about 22 years old. So tell us first about Grenada.
Well, first of all, I am so very pleased to be doing this interview with you, Deborah. I know the good work that you and the department and all those folks, as my kids would say in the olden days, did to bring us to where we are today. Growing up in Happy Hill, St. George's, Grenada, I grew up in an extended family situation where there were lots of women around. I'm sure there were men, but I remember all the women around because they were the mothers, they were the mentors, they were the role models. At the same time, I went to a convent boarding school run by Irish nuns. And so the world was really open up to me as a young person. I was also an avid reader and read just about every book that there was in the library, in the St. George's Library, and had a good sense of the world. Graduating from high school with Oxford and Cambridge Overseas School Certificate, which meant that the exams came from Oxford and Cambridge from England, and there was a special day in Grenada when everybody at a certain level would write those exams. And looking at what the future held for me as a young woman, I saw about 4 avenues. that I could be a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
I could be a nurse, I could be a public servant, I can work in a department store, or I can be a housewife, married with children or whatever. So there weren't a whole lot of things that were opened to young women at the time, not just to me, but for young women at the time. I also had a grandmother who believed that there was just so much more for a young, educated woman who believed in education and who used to say things like, education will raise the family nose. And for a long time, I didn't understand this education will raise the family's nose. But what she was saying is, we don't have much. We don't have much to do to support you in whatever endeavors, but with education, you can get yourself anywhere.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I started in education. I started with the pupil teacher system in Grenada, teaching with a master teacher who would come. Because in those days, there was nothing post-secondary on the island. If you wanted to be a teacher, you wanted to be a professional, you had to go away. And so a lot of the young people in Grenada and many of the Caribbean islands were going to the UK, were going to the US, coming to Canada, etc. for post-secondary. And as I said before, the families were making envelopes for the sons, because the sons were going to go there, their boys were going to go away and come back as a professional. And so I started looking at what was out there for me, and voraciously writing to all the universities, collected all the names. Of course, we didn't have Dr. Google and all of that at the time, but there were books. There were books with names of universities and addresses of universities. So I was writing, for admission, and I wrote to quite a few, US and Canada, and was told that, I was qualified, I had admission, but I had to have my transportation, of course. I had to have my accommodation, my tuition, and show how I would maintain myself for the 3 or the 4 year program that I would want to take. And of course, there was no way I could do this. And so I continued working as a pupil teacher, making $7 a month. And and at the same time, ensuring that my dream was not being diminished by the fact that I didn't have the wherewithal. I would say, I'd call it one blessed day. Someone told me about the fact that the Labor Department had a request from Canada for young women to come to work in the home of Canadian family. And if you work in the home of a Canadian family for 1 year, you can get landed immigrant status and you can remain in Canada.
Nice.
Well, of course, that's...
Yes.
I jumped at this together with many other friends. So we went and put our applications in, and there was a bit of a little kind of training program, if you wish, where they showed us, they had a mock-up Canadian home with a stove and
That's one of the questions, is because once you left Grenada and you come to Canada, the climate is very different.
Yes.
The lifestyle is very different.
Yes.
And you must have really needed to have that kind of support. What kind of supports did you have?
When I came to Canada, I had some idea of what the country was like, because studying and taking that colonial education experience, you learned about kings and queens and wars and mountains and rivers and all of those. So I had a good kind of knowledge, not experiential, but knowledge, book knowledge. And so I knew about things like subways and, all of those things. You kind of knowing and through reading is one thing, but through experience is completely different. Because I remember when I landed, and it was, I think, the month of May or early June. I thought it was cold, whereas other people were just,
Oh, wow.
we were into the good summer weather now. And then some of the things one had to learn very quickly, the money.
Yeah.
One had to learn the transportation system, how you get from point A to point B. Luckily, the program was such that you were not left on your own. And you'll find me kind of going back and forth in this discussion, because Canada at the time was supporting the Caribbean and the other areas coming out of World War II. There were all kinds of programs. Canada was building schools in the Caribbean. Canada wanted to assist the Caribbean with the unemployment of their young people. So this was all part of Canada's efforts. And so the Department of Manpower at the time, I think the name is now changed, but Manpower was the one who did all of the paperwork back and forth and matched young people with Canadian families, and met us at the airport, brought us to the YWCA in Montreal for overnight stay, asked us where in Canada we would like to go. And then when those of us who selected Toronto put us on the train with a Manpower staff, brought us to Toronto, and at the office matched us with the families who were there waiting for us.
So that was real service delivery.
So that
was
was
a very different environment now.
Exactly.
Mostly on third party.
That's right.
Organizations to provide those kinds of immigrant services.
So I was not on my own in terms of trying to find my way around. And of course, the families where we were kind of, that we were matched with, the families too were committed to ensuring that this young person not only had the responsibility of what they were being paid for, but also to be almost like family to someone that they realized was on her own.
Yeah. So you worked with the family, and then you were going to school. You were doing some university courses, I presume. There was part of that,
well, while I was working with the family, at the time, too, again, systems have changed and things have changed. There were all kinds of courses open in the evening that one can go. University of Toronto offered a lot of programs that you can just go and sit. You don't have to register or anything, but you can be part of a kind of educational environment. So once in a while, I would go to one of these universities. I also, at the time, went to the collegiate that was closest. And to take typing, because in those days, typing, if you really wanted an office job, you had to be able to type so many words a minute.
It's the only course my father made me take in high school. How sexist was that? You have to take typing because you may not go to university. You're going to need a skill. Typing is a skill.
Well, that's it. So I took typing. I used to go, I think, once a week for an hour to do, to take typing and to get some proficiency in that area, so that when I left the family, I would be able to work in an office. Although education, getting to Teachers College was really my goal. And so that's what I did. I filled my time. We also had a half a day when we were given time off. I think it was every Wednesday or every Thursday afternoon. And so we met at the Y. We met at the basement of the BME and AME churches. We found places where we would do each other's hair. And
you said BME. BME churches?
Yes.
Black minority?
No.
BME church.
BME, Black Methodist.
Okay. Because
Yeah,
they actually use that term in the UK a lot. They
yeah.
talk about BME communities.
No. There were the AME, the American Methodists, and there was the
Okay.
British Methodists.
Okay.
And there were a couple of churches where they would allow, then all the young women who were in that scheme, as it were, we would all show up there, and we would cook, and we would do each other's hair, or we would exchange information to give us that sense of belonging, that sense of community, that sense of
Did you ever discuss any of those kinds of issues that were percolating, in the 60s, in the late 60s? Any of those kinds of feminist issues, or was it just a matter of you were surviving, you were trying to find the friendships, you wanted, that network of friends, and it
Yes.
was more of a
Yeah.
collegial.
Well, it was important at the time. The Black community at the time, and the Black Canadian community at the time, were very much involved in those collegial, those sorority, those church groups, and looking at the interest of families and speaking for, the growth of families and the support. One of the early things was the fact that there weren't a lot of Black women engaged in a lot of activist things around. We were following I remember in the U.S., it was around the time of, the civil rights.
Civil rights.
It was all civil rights. It was the marching. It was the groups that were coming to Canada to raise funds, Canadians' engagement and involvement with, the Black movement in the U.S. So we were very much interested in that. The issue of apartheid and, again, organizing around that, the boycotts over the oranges, don't buy outspan oranges or South African wines, etc. So there was this activism that was going on at the time. Yet those of us, and people like myself, were looking at the paucity of things in the society that addressed the issue of Black women and their families. So that we were looking at, for example, when that commission went across the country, looking for over 15 years ago.
The Royal Commission on the Status of
On the
Women.
Status of Women.
Yeah.
There weren't Black women on there, neither were the issues that concerned Black women addressed. And so it was always the things that were happening in the society, the social issues, the policies, and maybe some things that pertain to legislative seemed to me, for all women, and that as Black women, we were always running behind, how about us, how about us? And trying to get ourselves as part of the discussion. I was fortunate in that very early, I met some fantastic women, Jane Pepino, Mary Lou McPhedrin, Mary Eberts, and I can go on. And they embraced and took me into the group. We were the ones who did a crime inquiry. We were the first ones to go out there in the city of Toronto and point at the violence against women, the abuse of women, what happened in at the High Park, where women were assaulted and whatnot. We came together and we started working on the whole issue of how the city could address the issue of violence against women. And that brought us into addressing the issues around policing. And that brought us to the issue around judicial education.
Yes.
And you have people like Pat Marshall and others who were very much in the forefront of that discussion. And that led us to the formation of METRAC, Metro Action Committee on Violence Against Women,
Which still operates.
Yes. And so things started to move. Women's consciousness, usually it women in the workplace, women in the marketplace, women in the home. Things started gradually to move in a direction where women's voices were getting heard or getting louder, as it were. At the same time, Black women were not seen as central to this. And for us, and I think to this day, there is still that struggle. It was still a hierarchy. It was white women first, and black women trying to find their way there. And there was always the whole business of white privileged women, and they would let one in, or they would let two in, or they would let some of us in, but not to get to the. I mean, we had organizations where you can see some of that. When the organization is run by white women and they're in the leadership, they get the funding, they were able to do things from coast to coast to coast. And as soon as black women started to be activists, to move themselves into the organizations, what happened is that white women draw back. White women, black women don't have the resources to carry, and so the organizations.
You were part of the Congress for Black Women.
Yes,
Tell us a
yes.
little bit about that organization, because I'm not
Yeah.
sure how well known it is, certainly to a lot of white audiences,
Yeah.
but certainly young women. They may not under really
Well, this is
understand.
why the Congress of Black Women came about as a result of women trying to say, we need to be there, trying to say we need to have our voices, trying to say that if we organize together,
Yeah.
maybe we can make our voices stronger. And we had been trying for national organizations for the longest while in the Black community. We had the National Black Coalition of
Yes.
Canada. We had the Harambe. We had so many organizations where we were trying to reach from coast to coast to coast to bring Black people together to talk about those issues that concern us in Canadian society. Because once we put ourselves out there as a mosaic, and we put ourselves out there as a country of diversity, you know, where multiculturalism and all those things are important, then it was important for all organizations and all groups and Black people to be seen to be part of this. And so the issue of the Congress of Black Women was really to organize Black women across the country to say, look, you're in Vancouver, you're in Halifax, you're in Calgary, you're in Toronto, and the issues for all of us are the same. And so how can we put our voices together? And I think that came up as a really clarion call around the time when the UN put out the call for the decade, the UN decade in 1975.
Yeah.
We had Kathleen, she was working in government sources, etc. She was on the board, on the committee that was making plans for Canada's involvement in the UN. Very, very active Black women's groups in Montreal, in Halifax, in
Who were some of
Toronto.
those women that
Many of them have passed on, now, but there are some who are still around. People like Juanita Westmoreland-Traore, who became a judge in Quebec. There was Yolande. What's Yolande's last name? There's a street that's named after her now. And that was also part of the organizing that had to happen. With Black women, we had Black women, English-speaking Black women, French-speaking, and how we put that together. And in the Congress of Black Women, we always had this what happens in this country, this French,
yes,
this
yes,
French
of course.
English
Okay, so
poet.
yes, so
You know?
you still had to deal with
We still had to.
those intersectional issues.
That's
'cause
right,
They were,
that's
you know,
right.
it's certainly not
Yeah.
monolithic.
Yeah.
You know.
So I think about 1970, 72 or 73, Kay Livingstone was able to get the women's groups in Montreal and the women's groups to come to Toronto. And we had this big meeting of women talking about the issues that face them and their families in the education system, in the world of work, as I said, in the marketplace and the workplace, and the things pertaining to their children, and laws and policies that didn't seem to support the needs of Black women. And so it was a very, very interesting conference. People like Ann Cools
Yes.
at the time I think she was a university student. I think a number of young people came from Montreal, and we had a really wonderful conference. I was not one of the organizers, but I was one of the volunteers checking people in, and at the end of the conference, because people had a really great weekend of exchange, and it's saying, "Wow, this is going on. This is going on in Montreal. This is our situation." And so there was a call to have another conference, and Montreal offered to host. And then we went from there, another conference in Windsor,
So you're dealing
Windsor,
with some of all the
Ontario.
big issues.
And
And did you then start making plans to do the lobbying so you could make changes?
we started, of course, once we were organized. We were organized regionally. Then you had the national, and then you had provincial bodies, and then we came together to, and to discuss the issues and to come up with recommendations and to make to do the advocacy in terms of meeting with and collaborating with other groups and meeting with government people, etc., to put some issues on the table.
I expect you were part of the National Action Committee. Now, I would presume that
Yes,
you would be very,
oh
and you
yes,
would have met
oh
some very
yes,
good
oh
good
yes.
women there that would have helped
They
your
were
cause.
just excellent, with the Judy Rebecks and Haviva Hosek, and some of those women were excellent. But at the same time, as you know, what brought about the I wouldn't say the demise, but what brought about the thing was the entrance of Black women into that very white privileged women's groups, and having those women attend to those issues that Black women were concerned about. It was very difficult to have the conversation, as we would say today, let's have a conversation, to have the conversation,
Yeah.
because there was always a denial of what happened, what your experience is, what my experience is. And because we couldn't agree on what exactly how we could address those experiences, a lot of the advocates were very much activist in terms of wanting things to happen and wanting things to happen now, and not having the wanting to finesse things in a certain way and be polite in certain gatherings, or be quiet in the
Citizen.
face of parliamentarians
Oh, okay.
and others. And so it created, for a long time, I think we had this creation in terms of organizations. We had the white privileged women's organizations that's doing things and saying they're addressing Black issues, and Black women are saying, no, we are not. We're not the ones getting the jobs. We're not getting the promotional opportunities. We're not getting the entrance into the rooms where things are happening. We're not on boards.
They're still talking about these are some of the issues
Yes,
that
yes.
racialized groups are still talking
That's
about.
right.
They're still talking about
Yes,
it. So
yeah.
there may have been some advances, but not enough. No, it's
There never is enough, and especially if you're an activist or an advocate, you want things to happen, and you want it to happen like today, like
yeah,
now.
yeah. But it's interesting because then after, there was that period, and then you were in education, you were, a
Yes,
teacher, a
yes,
principal. So the education issues would have been really important
yes,
to you.
yes.
And there's always issues about, either inherent biases, the racism, how the poverty, my good friend, Michael Coteau would talk about, the area that he represents in Ottawa, and some all of those pretty
Well, the
serious
thing is
issues.
that one of the big issues is the fact that we never had residential, like in the US, we didn't have residential pattern of
Oh, yes,
living,
okay.
so that you have a representative who represents these people. So as a Black community and as Black women, we were scattered around, and we had different representation in the political arena. To get into Teachers College, I had my own struggle. Despite the fact that I had all kinds of admittance to McGill, to U of T, to all of the universities at the time, the US included, when I went for teachers, for the documents to sign up for Teachers College, I was told that I didn't qualify.
I remember that
Yeah,
from
that,
your
that is,
documentary.
yes.
You talk about that in your
And so
documentary.
the whole issue of always having to prove yourself, always having to fight the system, to push against the system, and got to Teachers College, and I know that I was a good teacher, and my marks, my everything else were what it could be. But as I started teaching, I watched teachers who didn't have the wherewithal, they just came in to do the job and that was it. I see them being promoted to vice principal and moving up. And in the meantime, what I was doing was getting all of the, as my grandmother would say, all of the pieces of paper that was necessary. I was doing all the Ministry of Education courses. I was taking the new math. I was doing art, whatever, getting myself qualified. So by the time I presented myself for a vice principal's position, I had more than
enough qualification. What ages did you teach?
I was mainly grade 8.
Okay.
Mainly grade 8. But my first year, and I think it's important to say this, which was 1963 or 64, I had finished Teachers College. I had signed up with a Catholic board, and I was sent to the school. Then there was a nun who was the teacher, the principal of the school, and she gave me the grade 8 class, which I had asked for, and I took all the textbooks and whatever was necessary, and I went back to Grenada for a holiday. I came back. I spent maybe about 3 weeks preparing my chalkboard in those days.
Yes.
So I prepared, and the last week of August is when everybody goes in to get your classroom ready. When I got there, she met me at the door, and she said, "I'm sorry, but I got a man, a male teacher, and I had to give him the grade 8. The men don't want to teach the little ones," she said to me. And so I got grade 1.
Oh.
I started with grade 1. And in those days, there were no kind of numbers. I had 48 grade 1s.
Wow.
We had no kindergarten at the time, so they came almost tabula rasa.
Yeah, I started school those years. I think I started school in 60. I think I was 61. I was in grade 1.
Yeah.
So after the education, and then now I don't know if this is a job on the side or as part of the community, but you also got into housing. So the idea of housing, which, even today there's still problems with housing, but, social housing and education, those are two huge social issues.
But I think it's important to understand that all of these years and all of these things that I'm talking about, I just wasn't just going to school and back. I was involved in community organizing. I was building organization. I was chairing different community things. I was an activist. I was writing petitions. So I was very much in the community, doing things. And so there was a day job,
And the night job.
and then there were all of the activities in the community, and so while I was in education, I was invited to sit on various boards. I was on the board of Harbourfront. Again, Jim Fleming was the Minister of at the time, Multiculturalism. Had introduced me to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and when they took over Harbourfront, They wanted some people on Harbor Front to make sure that the buildings and everything else was community oriented, and so I was invited. And then I was invited to be on the board of Hospital for Sick Children, on the board of York University, the Donwood Institute, which was a mental health thing. So I was on different boards.
Did you have a family at the time? At this time, you must have had a family. At this time.
My daughter was born in 1970.
Okay.
And so a lot of this was prior to my daughter's giving birth, and at the time when you were principal in the Catholic system and you got pregnant, once you start to show, you had to resign your position.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think people understand that to this day.
So I had to resign. So I was home for a while and I was engaged in a lot of community work. And what got me back into education was the fact that there were very few teachers who wanted to teach music. And I was a music teacher. I loved the drama. I loved the singing. I loved the plays, the Easter play and the Christmas play and the preparation for First Communion and confirmation. And so I was the catalyst for a lot of the music programs in a few of the schools around. So once I was asked to resign because of my pregnancy, once the baby came, the superintendent, Margaret Lawler, I think was her name, came knocking at my door and said, "We need you back. We haven't had a music
A music program.
a music program, you know." So they got me back into the schools.
What I find interesting is because, I grew up in the same way where, you work, you have children,
Yes.
or not. Some people decide not
Yeah.
to, but you have a family.
Yeah.
And then you take on community work.
Yes.
You do everything.
Oh yes. Oh,
Whereas young women now, my daughters now, it's family, it's work.
yes. Yeah.
There's not a lot of time to do anything
Yes.
else.
Yeah. Yeah.
They compartmentalize a lot of their lives,
Yeah.
whereas we just sort of
Yeah,
felt like
well,
we had to do it all.
it just had to be done, you know.
Yeah, you
In the
need-
trunk of my car, I always had a kettle, some sugar,
I had a toy box.
and just everything in it. So
I had a
you go
toy
to the
box.
meeting, and and all of that came out.
Yeah.
So you could be part of community. The other thing too, I took my children on a whole lot of the demonstrations and the
Yep.
protests and the whatnot, you know. You drag them everywhere. I brought them to meetings. My kids knew all about meetings. I'll bring paper and chalk and coloring,
that.
and they'll sit on the floor.
Campaigns.
And
All my political campaigns.
yes,
We started the creches, so
Exactly.
if we were helping a
Yeah.
candidate
Yes.
run for whatever,
Yes.
we made sure that there was space with children's toys and a TV and a DVD. And a,
you know. And so my
VHS.
kids knew about meetings. So if I had to go any place, I'd just say, "I have a meeting tonight," and they'll say, "Is so and so going to be there?" You know, people like Roy McMurtry and a whole lot of people that we were all into thing, and they got to know folks, and they got to be part of also of the community. But the general idea was walking into those boardrooms, I remember when I just lost his name, Harry Arthurs came to talk, to ask me to be on the board of trustees of York University. One of the Bassett came to ask me as chair of the board for hospitals for sick children. And he says, "We hear you're doing great work there and you're not afraid to speak up, and we would like you on the board." And I get there. And Helen Vary was the only woman there.
Oh, okay.
And I was the only Black woman. I was the only immigrant woman. I was the only, again, talk about intersections. But trying to make my way to understand. And one of the things that I can say for myself, I'm an avid reader. And so I would read all the minutes and the notes and ask the questions and whatnot. And I think people like that when you're on a board with them.
I expect you would be better prepared than others.
Exactly. When I was a school principal, and we had a whole series of schools, we call them family of schools. There were about 17, I think, 17 schools in the area. And there were some of the guys who never, and I think I was the only woman too. They would never read the thing. They'd say, okay, whatever Jean says.
Yeah, I've heard this before where women work twice as hard and are twice as knowledgeable.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
yeah. Now I want to talk about politics. I mean, what was the context or experience? Like, all of a sudden, you know, you're the candidate in Etobicoke Lakeshore
Yeah.
in
93.
1993.
Yes. To go back a bit, I was sitting on these boards. I was also on the board of Status of Women.
Yes.
And I was appointed to that board shortly after that big blow up with Lloyd Axworthy and on the Status of Women,
yeah.
right? So on the Canadian Advisory Status and Status of Women, I was doing that while I was a school principal. We would meet Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I would leave at the end of the school day, catch my flight to Ottawa, participate Saturday, Sunday, and I was back to Toronto for my school very early in the morning on Monday morning. I was on different committees of, the Lucy Pippa was the chair at the time.
Julia Earle would have been the minister.
Yes. So I was in a committee that did some work on housing, women and housing. And so we had this big paper that we did on women and housing. And just around that time, there was a federal election. The Conservatives came in.
That's right.
And they did not reappoint those of us who were appointed by Trudeau.
Right.
So I came back to Toronto doing my thing. And the mayor called. And he said, that document you were working on with Status of Women, with the Advisory Council, that is really very good. And I think we need to have that kind of thinking going on at the Metro Toronto Housing Authority.
But what was really interesting about the Status of Women in those days and the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women is their focus on policy and research.
Yes.
So it wasn't about giving out grants.
That's right.
It wasn't a program.
Right. Exactly.
It was the policy,
the research, and then we used to have little booklets where we summarized the issues that we were working on, summarize the recommendations. It was very organized, very research-based with some really good people. Connie Backhouse,
well-known,
and and a few well-known researchers at the time who were really supporting the work of the Advisory Council.
Maureen O'Neill, who
had
been the coordinator for the Status of Women. When it really wasn't a department, it was just almost like a bureau.
Exactly.
Agency within a department.
Exactly.
Yeah. But she's always told me that.
So, we did really good work. So the city kind of knew, because I guess they must have been part of the research collection that was happening. Of course, with the new government taking over, that work got scrambled. So I was asked to sit on the board of Metro Toronto Housing.
Interesting.
And so I did that. The board met in the evenings, so it meant that I could do my schoolwork as a principal and attend the board meetings. At the time, it was really, really, it was a board that was where one side of the board was not speaking with the other half of the board.
Oh, lovely.
Right? And so as a result, I kind of could sit on either side because I just was not engaged in whatever the political squabble was. One side was very much what Haviva Hosek or Alvin Curlin, the ministry kind of was putting out. The other side was John Sewell,
yes, okay.
right, Elizabeth Hayworth.
So in 84, it was a federal conservative government, but in Ontario it became a liberal government.
Yes.
So
And after that, while I was there, then Bob Ray was now the premier.
yeah,
And what's her name? Evelyn Gigantes
Yes.
was my minister
Yeah.
at the time. So we started working, but it was very, very fractious. So at one point in time, it came to a head, and they decided that they were not going to renew John Sewell's appointment. And then I was asked to take the chair. Actually, the board, it seemed, decided that they would all go, but if the appointment of a new chair was not one that they wanted, and they all wanted me to be the chair. So I became the chair. But how can I do the chair and at the same time run a school? The Aviva Hosek went to the school board and negotiated a secondment for me.
Oh, good.
So that's how I was able to do Metro.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I had the school board,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the work went on, and we did really, really good work at Metro Toronto Housing. I had Oisy and some people engaged with me in terms of looking at the way the media was portraying people who live in public housing.
Yeah.
They were naming things like the projects. They were calling people's homes units. There was no security. You know, I brought a whole lot of changes to Metro Toronto Housing and got a lot of support from the government at the time to make the changes. John Tory, whom I had known when I was on the board of Harbourfront, because he was on the board of Harbourfront at the time, called me around 1992 sometime and said to me, I am going to be running Kim Campbell's campaign. Mulroney is going to be stepping down. Kim Campbell is going to be, I think, I'm going to be running Kim's campaign. I would like you to come with me. There've never been a black woman there, and you know the issues, and you can speak to the issues. So I kind of, laughed. I said, John, I am not conservative. In those days, I didn't have anybody's membership card walking around with. But I knew that I really was not, conservative in terms of my orientation. And so I said no. And then Bob Ray asked, and I said no. And then David Smith. He was
Stephen LeDrew.
Stephen LeDrew, and and a whole slew of them started kind of talking with me. And but the clincher was, if not you, who? You've had the experience, you've been on boards, you've done this, you've done the other, you have blah, blah, blah. Then you are an ideal candidate. My name at the time, too, was also well known because of the Metro Toronto housing work. With that question, and the other was, what have you got to lose? If you lose, you still have the school board. Remember, I was on secondment, right? You can go back to
day job.
Go back to your day job. And so I said yes. That was 1992. When I said yes, Evelyn Gigantes at the time, who was really furious that I was now going to be running came to see me to say that I couldn't continue to be chair of Metro Toronto Housing because, the way it would look, etc., etc. And so I stepped down from Metro Toronto Housing in the beginning, I think, of 93. So once I said yes, then there were problems. The Liberal Party at the time had, together with Sheila Copps and others, were pushing the whole notion of we want 30% women, 30%
Yeah.
women candidates.
Yeah, I remember.
Of course, they weren't meeting the mark of 30% women candidate because, as you know, women have to be asked, women have to be cajoled, women have to be whatever. And so they
Well,
didn't.
it's also because, you know, nomination fights are expensive and they're ugly and they're
Yeah,
horrible.
yes.
So
But
you
then
don't
those that
necessarily
they
get the women.
wanted to, those women that they wanted to support, they found a way to, you know, to help them. And so the privilege was given to the Prime Minister to make appointments.
Yes.
And so they were talking about appointments, so talking to me about appointments. They'll appoint me. At the same time, when they came up with different places, it just was not, I didn't think that was a winnable seat. So for a long time, I kept saying no every time they came up with something. I said, no, it's not winnable, because I felt if I was going to get out there, I wanted to be in a winnable seat. And so when the Etobicoke Lakeshore came up as a question, there was one person who was right to life and who had gone to all the churches in the area and had sold hundreds and hundreds of membership. Don McCash.
Yes, okay.
He had sold thousands and thousands of memberships. And so there was no way I could have caught up with that. And so the announcement was made, I think when he made an announcement, is it 9 or 11 appointed women across the country.
Yeah, he was leader of the party at the time, not prime minister.
Right? And leader of the party.
Yeah.
But mine got a lot of attention because the Star and all the papers, Star candidate, etc., and the disgruntled was saying, well, you know, appointing someone and not letting them go through, it's undemocratic. So we had that whole discussion. Anyway, I started my campaign, and
I had worked in that riding provincially because my brother was a provincial candidate in the election previous in the early 90s.
Yeah.
So
I had help from a lot of people from both at the provincial level and both at the a lot of the party came out. Although the party, the promises that were made to me at the time, I said, you know, I haven't run before, I've not been engaged in whatnot. I need a good campaign manager, I need a good fundraiser, and I need some help to, you know, to find a campaign office and whatnot. Yes, no problem. And as soon as they made the announcement and it was all out there, I didn't see any of them. I had to find my own campaign manager and my own fundraiser and move along.
But you were successful. The 93 election was enormously successful.
My goodness, I think I won by pretty close to 20,000 votes ahead of someone who was a sitting member who had done really good work in the area, whom I loved and respected, you know, but as Muhammad Ali said, I whooped him.
Well, that's yeah. I want to just do a little. You know, we have about 15 minutes left to have this conversation, and I just wanted to find out. So you're a new member of Parliament. You're the first, you know, black woman to be elected, and you became Parliamentary Secretary. And I think at one point were you like Parliamentary Secretary to
Jean Chrétien,
the Prime Minister?
And yes, and then I was Secretary of State for. When I got to the Parliament of Canada, no one had thrown breadcrumbs. There was no mentor or role model who had gone ahead there that I can say I'll follow this specific track. There were two black men ahead of me, and who had gone into the Parliament before me, and that's Lincoln Alexander and Howard McCurdy. But by 1993, they were gone, and so I had to make my way in that oh my gosh place. And I call it, and I'm sure you've heard this, a place built by men to do men's work.
Yes.
And, you know, and some of the things that we had to deal with, especially when I became right off the bat the chair of the Women's Caucus.
Yes.
And There were issues we had to deal with. Where can we find a washroom, women's washroom? Right on that front hallway was a huge washroom for men. I think they've changed it now into two. We had to deal with a whole lot of things.
But it was one of the first time, well, maybe for the Tories, but there was at least a good number of you. First of all, there was a
Well, that was the
strong
very,
caucus.
very first time we had that many women in the Parliament
Yeah.
of Canada.
And you had some women there that had been in Parliament before. Sheila Cobbs was there for quite a while, so she knew her way around. But it's not like when I was talking to Judy Arola, and when Judy Arola was elected, there was only 2 women in cabinet.
Yes, yes.
But the Prime Minister got Mark Lalonde to mentor her, like to hold her hand and help her in the first 6 months so that she could get acclimatized and understand what it's all about.
Well, they had a bit of mentoring after we were elected, or during the campaign, the last few phases of the campaign. I was matched. It was called twinning.
Yeah.
I was matched with John Manley.
Oh, yes.
And we still have fun with that, you know. You say, that's my twin. And so his staff would help to gather information for me. And when we got to Ottawa, of course, the whole business of where the offices are or to find the offices, all of those logistics, telephone numbers and whatnot, like I can go to his office for whatever help, or I can get some intelligence from him on different issues. But that was helpful. And we also had the women who were in the Senate at the time, who were also people like Ann Cools at the time.
Yes.
Was very supportive of.
And Joyce Fairburn.
Yes, Joyce.
So Joyce would have been very helpful.
Yes. So they were very. So it helped to find one's way around.
So what were some of the greatest accomplishments? Because you were there from 93 until
2005,
2006. So that's a long time.
Yes, well, I was
minister. So
yes, I was first Secretary of State for multiculturalism and the status of women. Those were 2 big portfolios. Looking back, they split it afterwards.
Yeah.
But I was running from one office to the next. Staff responsibilities, status of women, staff responsibility, multiculturalism.
What were some of the issues that you were working on? Do you remember some of the issues that you were working on for status of women?
Yeah, I think the issue around gender, the gender-based analysis,
Yes.
well, that was the big thing. And making sure that we looked at all of the departments as they bring whether it was called for resources or whatever program plans or whatnot, that they had the gender lens in there. And
they still use it today. Now it's even stronger now than it was then. In the early days, it wasn't that strong. It didn't have the teeth that it does now.
Yes. And so, I mean, those were important issues. And again, the issue of inclusion, although they didn't call it inclusion, but it was the beginning of the discussion that you can't put any group or committee or whatever unless, we had a number of women's involvement and engagement. We had a push for women getting placed on committees, like now the heads of committee, chairing committees, because there was a time there were no women chairs of any of the committees.
And I guess the orders and council appointments too, there was big changes there. So there would have been a lot more women appointed to various
we were
federal boards.
This was also part of so it was really a lot of policy work and a lot of work with the communities to understand where we were going and where we were heading. And again, having come through 1975 and the setup of the status of women's offices provincially and connecting with all of the status of women's provincial ministries, councils and whatnot. And I think I chaired 1 or 2 ministers' meetings. The same with multiculturalism. I think I was the first and only to call national policing in a multicultural society. Brought Australians, British, Americans to talk about how you police in a multicultural society.
The other big thing was your work around Black History Month. I mean, that was probably one of your crowning kind of your legacy.
Yes,
One of the...
there are two things I look at as part of my, or three things I look at as that I think is important legacy. One is my motion to create Black History Month in Canada, because at the time there was no thought about Blacks and Black history and Black Canadians. And we were talking about ice cream and yogurt, boneless beef, softwood lumber, the GST. I mean, those were the big things. And here I come asking for some information to be provided to members, and asking members to participate and to join with me in declaring February Black History Month in Canada. That was an uphill, because I'm not too sure that people were ready for this, including my own caucus, because it could have been negotiated differently if the chair of the caucus had taken it and negotiate with the other House leaders. He said they wouldn't think that's important. So I had to do it myself, which made it difficult. I had to talk to one by one by one by one by one.
Wow.
And the other day I was telling some young people that story, and one young fellow said, "So why didn't you send them an email?"
Yeah.
But I got that. So I consider Black History Month, when I see it celebrating from coast to coast to coast, and the things that's happening in entertainment, in religion, in the religious circles, in corporate Canada, in
the
whatnot,
Federal Public Service,
you know,
they
everywhere.
The whole month is really focused on diversity, inclusion, guest speakers. You know, every department has guest speakers.
And the other thing that I'm very proud of is the fact that I was able to put forward the motion to get the person's case on Parliament Hill, the famous five.
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of times the stories are told, nobody remembered that I spent the whole day trying to get that motion for the person's five, for the statue to be placed on Parliament Hill, and have John Nunziata each time say no.
Yes, but you had a lot of allies. You had a lot of
allies.
Oh,
yes.
House was an ally. Marlene Catterall would have been an ally.
Yeah.
You know, there would have been a lot of allies.
But you had to stand. You had to stand up. The allies. You see, that brings me to another discussion I was in fairly recently, where I picked up that whole notion that it's nice to have allies. Allies stand on the side, allies support you, allies say, "Go girl." But this person would say, "I don't want allies," right? I want accomplices. I want someone who would drive the getaway car with me.
Oh, that's a good.
You know, so I've been saying, but yes, because Sheila Copps had to rescind the motion that said only dead monarchs, prime ministers who were nation builders, statues could be on Parliament Hill. Yeah. So she had to get that out of the way. And then I had to work with Marlene, who was the House thing, to get it on the order paper. And then I had people like Patty Torsney, who at one was really helped to clinch it at the end, because after John had been there all day, each time I would have to stand up on a point of order. And Peter Milliken also has to be given some credit, because he just let me do the point of order.
So he was a speaker.
He was a speaker at the time. And so we got the person's...
And it's a beautiful statue. It is a gorgeous statue.
And everyone says, you just don't miss it when you go to court. You have to see it. And the third thing that I'm very proud of is the fact that for the very first time in the Parliament of Canada, I mentioned sickle cell disease, because sickle cell disease is a disease that is very prevalent in the Black community and in the
Mediterranean.
Mediterranean. That's the word.
Mediterranean.
Yes, and have gotten really good research, really good things that are happening right now in the area of viewing sickle cell as something that is important to be part of any kind of medical, discussion on diseases in Canada.
This has been really, really, really interesting. There's just two very quick last questions. If you had to do it all over again, would you do it differently?
No, if I had to do it all over again, I'd do the same thing, because I think circumstances, right? The right person in the right place at the right time, with the right amount of, of supporters and whatnot. And I'm not too sure that doing it differently would create the synergies, would get the same results. There is also something that I say quite often. I picked up way back when, I don't know. Opportunity dances with those on the dance floor.
Oh, nice.
So I've been on the dance floor when opportunity came to do what and to present, my case to those for whom it mattered.
So this then leads me to the next question: is what advice would you get? What advice would you give young women who want to make a difference? You'd probably tell them to get on the dance floor.
Yes, I'll say be bold, be brave, go with your gut, because in a lot of instances, it's what is in your gut. You just want to make sure that you don't allow others to dictate where it is you want to go. And that old poem written by, and I just lost his name now, it's the two roads lead off you take the one less traveled by.
Yes. Okay. We'll find out. We'll find the quote. The road less traveled.
Yes.
The road less traveled. We'll find the quote. Anyway, this has been really, I can't thank you enough for doing this.
Thank you.
I want to talk to women who inspire other women.
Yep,
so you've got a very inspiring story. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Deborah Davis, President and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.